We are Jalen and Jacoby. What is it that we do?
We get justice and get the people what they want.
Later on in the show, we'll be joined by social and political commentator Angela Rye to offer her perspective on what we are going to discuss first. Yesterday, as you all know by now, Derek Chauvin, former Minneapolis police officer, was convicted on 3 counts involving the murder of George Floyd on a 9.5-minute video that we all watched last spring and summer. Jalen, it was a very tense time as this verdict was about to come in. How did you feel in that moment? What was your reaction after the verdict came back guilty on 3 counts?
Sadly, my stomach was in knots. Even though with my own 2 eyes, I saw a police officer murder another man while he was handcuffed by placing a knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And as a Black man in the United States of America, understanding that usually those police officers do not get convicted. It was extremely rare to see that take place. So for anyone wondering why is everybody celebrating, that's why. And the next point I want to make, Jacoby, how did we get here? You know, in football, there's a lot of talk about field position. You know, I like to use that as it pertains to race relations as well. What's the difference between slavery and the KKK and Jim Crow and Emmett Till and Rodney King? The progress of the movement and also the influence of 2 things, protest and smartphones. Those 2 things now literally hold the police accountable for their actions. And in this case, I don't believe, to be honest with you, without those 2 things, as well as the incident that took place on January 6th, they became the catalyst to the actual verdict. So I want to send my condolences to the family of George Floyd. Obviously, we celebrate that Derek Chauvin is going to be punished for his actions, but I want to make sure that we acknowledge the power of your voice and the power of protest. And shout to Stephen Jackson, too, because all of that field position matters. And what I would like to know, Jacoby, is what happens next? Because while we celebrate, are there going to be police reform bills taking place? When this takes place again, because it's going to take place again, it continues to happen. We know way too many names of it happening. What's going to be different? And so I appreciate the verdict. I'm happy justice was served. It's going to be interesting to see how much time he actually does behind bars.
We will find out in about 2 months when the sentencing happens, but you use the word celebrate a lot, and it was a conflicted sort of celebration. I mean, I felt relief and frankly surprise when the verdict came in because the New York Times put out a study, right? And since 2005, there's only been 7 murder convictions for police officers. Think about that. And they did the math. That's about 1 in every 2,000 occurrences. That's how rare that this happens. That's just how rare it happens. And as you mentioned, this does not happen unless Darnella Frazier takes out a phone and records that. And that is a very brave act to record the police doing something that they believe is wrong. And without that recording, this doesn't happen. Without the global protest, this conviction does not happen. And while this brings justice for George Floyd, it does not for Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, and countless other names that we all know, that we've all seen. And when you say what happens next, I don't know. But hopefully this can be a pivot point. This can be a turning point to see more justice in these cases as we move forward. And as we move forward, we will have Angela Rye join us in the next block. But right now we're going to turn our attention to sports because we have some big news in the world of sports as well. Last night, the Nets, powered by Kyrie Irving, got a win against the Pelicans. However, there is some bad news. James Harden suffered a setback in his hamstring rehab. He's now out indefinitely. Jalen, we don't know when he'll be back. Hopefully he will be back for the playoffs, but they're not trying to put a timeline on it. While they did get a win last night, what does this mean big picture for the Nets season?
Jacoby, you know I need 4 eyes, right? I need them. And I watch the Nets play when they're healthy, and know Kevin Durant has been Finals MVP twice. And I know he can't wait to get to the playoffs to turn it out. James Harden, I know he's one of the most terrific scorers in the game and the most unique offensive weapon that the league has seen. That's an absolute fact. Kyrie Irving dazzles with the basketball. He's among the elite in scoring, finishing, mid-range, three-point shooting, and he's also a champion. I was in the gym, right wing, Cleveland Cavaliers, made the jump shot over Steph Curry. I was there. I know what my eyes see. These are 3 of the top 12 players in the whole league. And if they were at the park, they should win all day. But this ain't the park. And there's 90 days approximately left in the NBA season. And I now believe, because of the multiple injury concerns that the Nets have had, the lack of chemistry that they're going to be able to garner from a coaching staff throughout their roster that has added so many new pieces, that also has to deal with dominant bigs in the East like Embiid, Giannis, and Bam. When I saw this news, you know what came to mind for me, Jacoby?
What's that?
The Nets not winning the East this year.
Ooh. See, I think you're wrong about that. Jalen Rose, you're telling me if Kyrie, KD, and James Harden are all in uniform on the floor for the playoffs, you still don't have them coming out of the East to go in the finals?
Jacoby, I know that they have 3 of the top players, the top 12 players in the league. I know that. But I respect chemistry. I respect the journey. And I understand when it's going to be moments in games where that level of trust is going to have to be there to get a defensive stop. And remember, they also struggled defensively overall, period. I just want to give credit to the other teams. I want to give credit to the growth of Philadelphia and what they did with their roster and how Embiid has blossomed into an MVP candidate, to a dominant force, and how Ben Simmons is a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, and how Tobias Harris is now playing really good basketball and they got shooting around him, and how Milwaukee added Drew Holiday to go with Middleton. They still have Giannis. They still have Lopez. Like, I just really appreciate what those teams have been able to grow. So based on that, I want to give them credit, not necessarily deny the Nets. And based on this news, I now feel the Nets won't win. The Nets will not win the East this year.
The Eastern Conference playoffs, if these 3 men are healthy, will truly be a test of consistency, system, chemistry versus just straight up talent. And I think that we'll be addressing this again. And of course, right now, we will also have to address the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial here in the South Street Seaport District of Manhattan, brought to you by Chase. Welcome back to Jalen and Jacoby. Jalen, we have the honor, we have the privilege of being joined once again by social and political commentator Angela Rye. Thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you for having me.
Angela, when you heard the guilty verdict for Officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, what was your initial response?
My initial response was disbelief, like so many of us. It wasn't 1 count of second-degree manslaughter, not 1 count of second-degree murder or 1 count of third-degree murder. It was all 3 of the charges brought against him. And so there was a little bit of disbelief. Then there was some relief. Then there was some worry, because I was like, oh, sentencing is in 2 months. It's actually going to be the day after Juneteenth, on June 20th. When we really understand his fate. I was on Clubhouse last night, this app. I don't know if you all are familiar or have used it, but I was talking about how, even with the bit of relief I feel, there's something in me that feels a little bit of guilt, because I don't really like the carceral system, right? I don't think that it's really there to rehabilitate anyone. But similarly to how I think so many of us have looked at these cases in the past, I was like, the whole system is actually on his back, and you all need to prove to Black people that you care about us enough to punish people when our lives are taken. So a lot of dichotomy and hypocrisy even in my feelings about yesterday.
Angela, what do you feel are the next steps in police reform? And can you educate the audience about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act?
Yeah, Jalen, it's such a good question. I think what is so interesting is today there are articles coming out about what members of Congress, white members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are saying about police reform. They're saying that this verdict means that there's less pressure for police reform. And I'm saying, how? At the end of the day, this is one verdict. And there are so many others where there have been no consequences or just barely consequences. And so, what we did hear yesterday from Kamala Harris, what we did hear yesterday, even from President Biden as well, was that it's time to continue the quest for police reform, whether you believe there's an ability to reform the system or you believe that the system in and of itself needs to significantly change to the point where it's overhauled and we create something completely new to restore justice and safety in communities. Just the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has passed the House of Representatives. It passed last Congress, reintroduced by Congressmember Karen Bass this Congress, who was the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus last Congress and really led the way. It has passed again just last month in March. And what we're waiting for is Senate action. We're waiting for senators on both sides of the aisle to say, you know what, this matters enough. Whether this is a vote that would cost me my seat, what I know needs to be the truth in 2021 is that it's okay for Black people to live and thrive in this country. Qualified immunity is on the table in that bill. Looking at varying implicit bias issues, money for training, all of those things are in this bill. There are a number of activists among us, Jalen, who say, you know what? The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act does not go far enough. And I understand that. But what I'm not willing to do anymore is say, you know what? Nothing is better than something. That's not my posture. And I think that we can't afford to toe that line. When you consider that even at the press conference that Attorney Ben Crump held yesterday, right after the verdict, they were talking about justice and policing. What we know is that the system has to change. In order for the system to change, policies must shift. Are the only people responsible for changing policy at the federal level and members of Congress in the House and the Senate? Absolutely not. We need to see these same kinds of reforms, abolition, defunding, divestment at the state and local levels as well. Today, we also know that Merrick Garland, who is the Attorney General, is holding a press conference to talk about an intensive and broad sweeping investigation into police practices in Minneapolis. We all know just from the sheer number of police officers, law enforcement officers who were at the Capitol on January 6th, that broad sweeping investigation doesn't just belong in Minneapolis. It belongs all over this country. Those are the only kinds of things that will happen when you have legislation on the books. They can't just roll out piecemeal investigation after investigation. I am rambling. I want to hear your questions and your thoughts, but I think it's so important to understand all of the many layers. And when you peel one back, there's so many more to go. So that's why it's hard to completely breathe.
Well, you're not just rambling, you're making some really good points. And I think the one thing that people need to not overlook is while Derek Chauvin was found guilty of these charges, there were 3 other police officers there on the scene that did not take action to stop Derek Chauvin from committing this murder. Now, in the wake of this case, there was this uprising, there was this global protest, and in the wake of that, there were statements made by corporations and promises to have more diversity at the corporate levels, up and down the entire hierarchy. There are also sports leagues that donated money and made promises to include more diversity in the front offices of their teams and their structures. Now that we're sort of 8 to 9 to 10 months removed from that, how do you feel about the work that's been done since these promises were made?
Well, the first thing I would say to you, Jacoby, is it's frustrating that it took us watching the death of a Black man for 9 minutes and 29 seconds for corporate America to realize that Black participation, involvement, engagement for other members of the BIPOC communities, right? Like that now we matter. Now our voices should be heard. Now Black Lives Matter should be in the signature of my email, right? Like it actually is frustrating. It is disrespectful to have to go that far to just get us to some point of equity. And what I will say is that I hope that it doesn't take another crisis. But I can tell you from my own experience, from conversations that I was even having this weekend, really am more attuned to, reading this really powerful book by Resmaa Menakem called My Grandmother's Hands. And he, of course, talks about white fragility. Many people will know the book written by Robin DiAngelo as well. And you find yourself often in situations with people in corporate America, with some of your white friends, where you're comforting them, letting them know, like, the road might be long, but it's worth it, right? Meanwhile, we're just trying to ensure that we can get on equal footing after being a part of this country, its institutions, its systems for more than 400 years, helping to build the things that oppressed us, right? And so what I'm saying is, I think that we really have to get to a point where there is meaningful systemic change, not lip service, not a promissory note on diversity, not a pledge that you take and ask all your corporate friends to sign on, like real meaningful change. And part of that begins in our bodies, which is Resmaa's point. All of us are carrying around some type of trauma, walking around unnaturally and unreasonably so, fearing each other. And we're not going to get very far like that. And so it really is time for the folks who are the instruments of the oppressive systems to engage in real radical shifts. And radical should not scare the people who are watching at home, who might also watch the super conservative news station. It just means big change.
Angela, in sports, oftentimes athletes and coaches argue at the officials. And usually when people watch the game, they say, I don't know why they're arguing at the ref. They're not going to change the call. But when you play the game, you understand they're actually doing it for the next call. So can you acknowledge the power of protest and what that played along with January 6th in the actual verdict?
The thing that's so fascinating to me about that is I've spent the last few days thinking about the power of protest for us historically. I think for a lot of folks, some young folks, some people who don't engage in activism or organizing work at all, they think that the George Floyd protests were new. They weren't. They are part and parcel of everything that was stood up and created around the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That was a movement that started after Trayvon Martin was killed by a vigilante, George Zimmerman, and there was no repercussion for his actions. Yet and still, we know that we've made progress. There's, the truth about this country is that 100 years after the poorest white people could vote, Black people finally got the right to vote. The truth about this country is even after we finally got the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act was completely gutted. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was completely gutted in 2013 in a Supreme Court case called Shelby versus Holder. The truth about progress is that it ebbs and flows, and more so for any other group of people in this country, it is for people of color. And so right now, folks are protesting Georgia because voting rights are once again on the line. So it's not that any one particular movement, I think particularly around Black movements and Black politics, we can't afford to just take one thing and say we're just focusing on just living today. We have to focus on living and voting, because if we don't change policy, we can't live, right? We have to focus on our economic opportunity and rights and salaries and wages and being paid fairly and access to capital, because if we don't have our economic power, we can't move the needle on any of these other things. It is all part and parcel of what it means to find your real power in this country and to dwell in it.
That's really well put, Angela. Thank you so much for offering your time and your perspective here on Jalen Jacoby.
Thank you very much.
We will be back with much more right after this.
Thank you.